Hello and welcome to Breaking Bad Passwords. If you're joining us live, our speakers are in the Slido discussion answering your questions right now. For audio or video issues, click the technical support button below. I'd now like to turn it over to Hamed Marathi and Willem Mouton for the presentation.
Hi, welcome everybody to joining our little presentation on passwords. My name is Willem Mouton. I'm the head of research at this company called Sensor Security. We're part of the CyberCX group in Australia. My colleague Hamed Marathi is also a senior security consultant at Sensor Security. At this point, I would just like to say thank you for listening to yet another talk on passwords. Passwords have been around since the dawn of computers. It's been discussed, well discussed, complained about. And this talk is not going to be about the merits of whether passwords is still relevant or secure or anything like that. Today, we just want to discuss our findings and data that we've analyzed during the course of the assessments that we do. At Sensor Security, we do quite a number of different types of security assessments, and we would like to take you guys through what we've seen over the last couple of years and how we can use that to hopefully improve the general state of passwords in the industry. Passwords are still basically the de facto means of authentication. It's used everywhere, from small online retailers to some of the biggest corporates in the world. It generally still relies on user-generated, or chosen values. And the funny thing is, in today's world, the average user has more credentials than ever before in history. And we, so like I said, we do different types of security assessments, and we usually play the role of the attacker, and we take full advantage of the fact that there are general weaknesses within the whole concept of passwords, right? So at this point, like I said, passwords have been around a long time. It's been discussed over and over and over again over the last 20 to 30 years. There's been various pieces of advice given out over the years, from length, complexity. I like to typically use this little XKCD, image. It kind of explains where we are today in terms of, generating random, complex passwords. But the thing is, it's not really worked out the way we wanted it to work out. Breaches still happen every day. Password-based breaches are probably one of the most common, types of breaches that happen over and over and over again. And that's why we decided to take a little bit of a look, not just at the passwords themselves, the common password, things like that, but also, password policies. What do corporates put in place to try and remedy this? And where do they stand? And the data kind of surprised us a little bit, because we had some preconceived conceptions of what it should look like, because typically we tend to look at assessments on a assessment by assessment basis. But what we've done is, for the purpose of this talk, we've taken the last 3 years worth of data that we've collected via various types of penetration tests, from our red teams, network pen tests, web applications, everywhere that we could actually go in and get access to large sets of password data. Typically, those would be in the form of a compromised Microsoft Active Directory, because that's the most common common piece of technology used, across large corporates. And we set out, our initial goal was just to look at, what do passwords look like? But we quickly realized that it goes far beyond just the passwords. There's a lot of user behavior. And we started looking at how does, corporate password policies drive user behavior, and what influence that has, and, whether a strong or weak password policy actually have an impact on whether on the behavior of users when choosing different passwords. So at this point, Hamed is going to take you guys through a little bit of the password policies.
Yes, so within our industry, we have 4 different major industry guidelines and standards. So NIST CIS benchmark and Australian Cybersecurity Centre Information Security Manual, or ACSC ISM, which is a Australian government benchmark, and PCI DSS. So when we were going through our data and we had started our analysis of the data, we saw that most of the organization, because they're using Windows Active Directory, so most of the organization are using the Windows recommendation and values as per their recommendation. So that's why we included Microsoft in our analysis as well. So just a quick walkthrough over the different terms of the password policy. So we have things like minimum password length, which is the minimum number of characters that when you choose a password, you have to comply with that. Like if it's the minimum character set is 8, so your password should be at least minimum 8 characters. So the complexity, it means that whether you are allowed to only have numbers in your passwords or it's just lowercase, uppercase. So if the complexity is enabled, you have to have a uppercase, lowercase, or numeric in your password. And the next parameter is the password history. So basically what it means is the number of previous passwords that the user has been used. So they cannot use, for instance, if it's 24, the value of the password history is 24, the users cannot select or choose the last, the previous 20 passwords of their own. So, and they have to come up with a new one. Or so the next one is the maximum age or the password expiry in days. So for instance, if a password policy has 90 days of the maximum age or the password expiry, it means that each 3 months or after 90 days, the users have to change their password. So they get a pop-up which says that your password is expired and you have to change your password. And the next two parameters are lockout threshold and lockout duration. So lockout threshold means that after so many or these many failed attempts, your account or the user account get locked. So if it's 10, so you have only 10 failed attempts. So after that, your account is locked. And the duration means for how long your password or your account is locked. So if it's 15 minutes of the lockout duration, it means that once your account is locked, you cannot try for the next 15 minutes. So you have to wait for 15 minutes and then you can have the next try. So the Microsoft, what they recommend for the minimum password length is to have an 8-character password. Complexity is enabled. The password history is 24. The maximum age or the expiry is 42 days, which is a week more than a month. So it's 5 weeks. And the lockout threshold is 10 attempts, and the lockout duration is, if I'm not mistaken, is 15 minutes. And for the NIST, they don't really set any. They don't really set any restrictions, but what they recommend is to have a minimum password length of 8 characters. And there are different parameters involved here. Like they don't say you have to have the complexity enabled or disabled, and they don't force. So they recommend not to force the users to expire the password every one month, 2 months, or 3 months. So what they recommend is as long as your password is not compromised and it's a strong password, you are good to use that password for as long as you can. And the next one, CIS, so which has the highest minimum password character length, which is 14, and ISM and PCI DSS. So we use this as our guidelines where we started our analysis, and what we saw was, so this is the password policy. So what we saw was 41% of the organization, they have a minimum 8 characters as their minimum password length. And so, followed by the 7 characters. So altogether, about 63% of the organization, they have the bare minimum of the password password length. So it means that if you set a default and not a good password policy, most of the organization, they don't bother to increase that minimum, and most of the users, as we see in the next few slides, they just follow the bare minimum. So it's very important to set to have a very good baseline, because most of the organization and the user, they don't change that behavior. And based on our data, the average minimum character for the passwords across the different organization is 8.1, which is again the minimum recommended. And what was very interesting was that 43% of the organization, they are aligned with Microsoft and NIST, and 22% aligned with PCI, DSS, and Microsoft, followed by ISM. And interestingly, only 1% are aligned with CIS, which has the most lengthy password length. And for the password history, 46% of the organization, they have the 24 password as the password history. And 46% of the organization, they are aligned with Microsoft and CIS benchmark, 29% with ISM, and 8% with PCI DSS, and the rest, but they have different values. And in terms of the lockout duration, almost half of the organization, they have a minimum 30 minutes lockout duration. So it means that if your account is locked, you have 30 minutes to wait, and then you can try and attempt more. So what is really interesting in this case is if you have a short lockout duration, it gives a good opportunity for the attackers to perform the brute force or password guess much more faster. So they don't need to wait for 2 hours, 3 hours, or whatever the duration is to try an attack. So they have shorter windows so they can attack faster. And 61% of the organization, they are aligned with PCI DSS, 60% with CIS, and the rest, they have different values. And same with threshold. So as I mentioned earlier, the threshold is the number of failed attempts, and 60% of the organization we see they have 5 failed attempts, and 24% or almost a quarter of the organization, they have a 0 as the value. So 0 means that there is no lockout. So, and it means that the attacker or we as a tester, we have unlimited number of times to try and guess a password or to attempt to crack, to brute force the passwords. And 36% of the organization, they are aligned with ISM, only 13% aligned with Microsoft and CIS, 9% with PCI and DSS standard, and 42% they have different, or it could be unlimited. And password complexity is very straightforward. 80% of the organization, they do have a password complexity set. So the users need to have a complexity in their passwords, like password 1 with capital P and numbers at the end. And in terms of the password expiry, so 34%, they have a 90 days, which is 3 months. So after 3 months, the password gets expired, and followed by 60 days or 2 months. 16% of the organization, they enforce 2 months, and 14% of the organization, they have a 5 weeks or a bit more than 1 month of the password expiry. And 35% of the organization, they are aligned with ISM PCI DSS, 15% are aligned with CIS, 14% aligned with Microsoft, and the rest, they have different password expiry requirements. So our clients, they are in different organizations or different sectors. So we have clients in government, technology, insurance, healthcare, and these are the average values that we see across our data set. And I'll pass to Willem to go through this with you.
Yeah, so
what's interesting about this is, like I said, at the beginning of the slides, we had some preconceived ideas about who would be doing it better, what we expected to see. Typically out of experience, and this is not taking a swipe at governments, but government organizations tend to lack a little bit. So we figured government institutions would probably be at the lower end. Technology companies are typically seen as at the forefront of doing, cutting edge stuff. So the user base is also supposed to be a bit more tech savvy than the average user. So my expectations was when we started looking at the data that government would be at the lower end and technology companies would be far ahead. Banking and financial, a lot of them are covered by PCI DSS, so they have to align with that. But I would have expected to see much stronger policies in that area. What we ended up seeing was that on the balance of the whole, pretty much everybody just when it came to length, on average, people just stuck to the defaults or the Microsoft recommendations or the bare minimum that is prescribed to them, which is, again, after talking about password and password security and the concept of complex and long passwords and passwords versus passphrases, this is surprising to see that at an organizational level, it hasn't really changed, and it is still being done either by default or the bare minimum that gets, that people are required to do. And all of that stuff is great. I mean, all of these numbers, are makes for great pie charts. But if I had to put my bad guy hat on, like I said, we do this for a living. When we see password policies like this, I mean, a couple of things spring to mind for us. I mean, if we see password policies with 8 to 9 character, length, minimum lengths, we immediately know that, there's going to be some, there's some short, easy guessable passwords that we're going to find. And again, we do this with such regularity that we know once we get in, we're probably going to progress through the network and compromise the rest. And once an attacker has actually moved into your network and gained some form of privilege, getting access to the rest of your organizational passwords are typically easy. And with short lengths enforced, it makes cracking and recovering those passwords pretty trivial. But we'll see that in a couple of slides. Another thing to considering is high lockout thresholds. This aids us, if we want to perform password spraying or password brute forcing attacks, not being locked out greatly improves the efficiency of which we can perform those attacks. On the other side, long lockout timeouts has a detrimental effect on companies. So we can pretty much perform a denial of service attack against users by just locking out their accounts and having them stay locked out for an extended period. Also, one of the components of the password policies is the password histories. So if there's a short history or not a history enforced, it creates the ability for users to start recycling passwords, alternating between numbers, letters, or just maybe using 1 or 2 base passwords and just keep on cycling through them. So overall, it does create, if your password policy is not optimal for your organization, it does create quite a few gaps with which, can give attackers the advantage when trying to breach your network. So password policies, typically we don't really see a lot of people talking about them because they're pretty boring. And like I said, I mean, I think people believe that we understand them well enough, and that it's a well understood problem. But what is like having that policy defined is all well and good. But in the next couple of slides, we're going to actually look at passwords that's conforming to those password policies that we've just analyzed. And the big problem is that users are typically not educated. And when I say not educated, I know that we spend a lot of time within organizations doing user awareness training and putting out flyers and things like that. But I sort of refer to this as the mom test. If I look at my mom's password after she's gone through everything at her work and her educational training, and I still look at what she does with her passwords and she handles her passwords, that's kind of indicative to what the normal non-technical user on a network would be. And if my mom is failing at this, I'm pretty sure a lot of other people inside of your organization is still failing, going to be failing at this. MFA comes up a lot in conversations, and we can also touch on that in a bit and at the end. MFA is great, but it's not going to cover you, for everything. There's a lot of misconfigurations that can happen around that. And then the last one is weak passwords that is still going to be, that's still being allowed by the password policies that are, being defined.
Yeah, so during our engagements, one of the primary goal or one of our goals is to compromise the domain controllers in a Windows environment or take over the Active Directory. And when we do that, we dump a file which is entered, so technical way is NTDS file. So basically it's a database of the Active Directory containing all the information about the username in Active Directory, including the password hash, the history, and the membership and everything. So when we obtain that during our engagement, we try to crack the hashes or to obtain the clear text passwords. And these data that we analyzed are based on the actual cracked password that we did. And what we used for to just give you an idea of this is not a difficult task or difficult job. So in terms of the cracking, so what we use for cracking the hashes are it's a normal PC with 4 GPUs. And normally because of the time constraint that we have during our engagements, we usually spend between 2, 3 to maximum 5 hours in cracking the password. So we don't spend that much time because we don't have that long time during our typical engagements. So what we see in our data is that almost half of the passwords that we crack, they are following the 8 characters. So they are 8 characters in terms of the password length. And this is in line with what we saw in the password policies. So again, this shows us that if you have a weak password policy and if you set the bare minimum for the users, they just follow the bare minimum. So they don't increase that bar that much often. And almost 60% are, as we will see in the future slides, in the next few slides, almost 63% or 65% of the passwords, they are in the 8 to 9 characters. And in terms of the password, and as the password is more lengthy, like in terms of the length, it is less crackable, less guessable, because one of the things that we do on daily basis in our engagement is we try to guess the passwords to get in, or to get the initial foothold in the network. So if you have a longer password, it's more difficult to crack. And in terms of the character sets, 42% of the password, they have a mixed alphanumeric, means lowercase, uppercase, and a number, like password 1 with capital P, and followed by lowercase alphanumeric, like password 1, but all characters in lower. And the question is, does size or the length really matters? And the answer is yes. So almost 60%, well, 60% of the passwords that we see where the users are using, they fall under 8 to 9 characters of the length. And it's about 73 of the passwords from 7 to 9 characters, which covers the bare minimum of the standards, which we see in PCI DSS, Microsoft, and NIST. So again, this is another proof that if you have a minimum requirements, most of the, or 73% of the users, they just follow the bare minimum. So it's very important to have a strong password policy. And so what we see, so if you Google for things like weak passwords, common passwords, so what you can see in all of those search results is all the researchers shows that you will see welcome 1, password 1, or 1 welcome, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 6, 7, 8. But what was very interesting in our case or in our research was that we see lots of patterns based on the company name. So we see things like company, like if the company name is ABC, for instance, is ABC123, ABC @ the current year, which is 2020, or @ 2019. And these are the 4 top passwords that we see in our industry. So it's a very good indicative of for an attacker and as a tester point of view. So if we want to try or we want to guess a password during our engagement, so this is typically what we go for. Like we take the company name, we add the current year, @ the current year, and in most cases we will get a hit. Or with things like welcome 1 or password 1. So most of our engagements we see at least one of these weak credentials. And the top 10 base words that we see is welcome, password, the current season, or the current week of the day. So again, this is very useful for attacker and the testing and the tester. And in terms of the permutation of the passwords, so for almost 44% of the passwords that we see, the format follows the first capital and the last number, like password 1. And 21% of the passwords, they have 2 digits at the end, and 60% of the passwords, they have a single digits at the end. And the statistics or the data shows that the last 4 digits of the passwords, they have the following a trend, which is, for instance, the current year.
Okay, so now that we've spent some time on this and we've looked at the numbers and the passwords, and again, I don't suspect that a lot of this stuff is new. I think this is ground that's been covered, quite a bit. But the reality is, we still see this on a daily basis, right? So, what can we do with this? Some common blind spots that people have when setting, password policies or deciding on how to implement password controls, they tend to focus on the defaults that's provided. Again, like we've seen, Microsoft probably has the biggest influence on password policies in corporate environments, but just purely by, because they provide Active Directory infrastructure. But, common things that you need to look out for when managing your passwords within your organization is making sure that you don't allow users to set passwords from that's contained in previous breaches. Blacklist dictionary words. Try and discourage repetitive sequences. And also, the biggest thing that we can say is, context-specific words like your organization. Every company does, and I know this from experience, that there's a company-specific password in every single organization, right? That is a very, very bad idea because those tend to leak out. And, based on the analysis that we've seen, it's typically very easy for us to get that. Like I mentioned before, MFA is in some of the previous slides is a fantastic control, and it's very effective. The problem is that MFA does have some drawbacks. There are some weaker implementations of MFA. But the biggest problem with MFA is that it's not consistently applied across all interfaces. You typically find it on very select or what people deem critical interfaces on the perimeter, like your Office 365 or your Mail or your Exchange or things like that. But a lot of other authentication points on the perimeter that still do tie in with AD is not necessarily covered by that MFA. A typical example would be PowerShell for Exchange or legacy entry points into your mail system. Where the web UI does enforce MFA, those entry points typically, we find that that MFA has not been enabled on them, right? So going forward, this is just some practical advice. Now, again, not a lot of this is not earth-shattering, but just please keep that in mind. From a human factor, ongoing user education and like I said, I do know that we do spend a lot of time with our corporate training and things like that. But maybe users need to be made more aware of the actual consequences, of how breaches occur, how frequently they occur, and what the consequences to the organization as well as their own privacy is. Right? Encourage them not to use corporate credentials in public, on public websites. We see this every day where we look at public breaches which are from random gaming sites or social media sites, and instead of looking for corporate domains, we just look for corporate names based on the password patterns that we see. And you can actually identify private email addresses using corporately associated passwords. Okay, so there's a lot of information that can be gained out of that. Monitor and inform. I mean, you can also aid your users in actually monitoring their own accounts, their private accounts, to have them notify when they pop up in a breach list. Password managers is great software, and it's a great recommendation. But encourage users to use it in their private lives, not just for their corporate lives. Strong password policies, like we said, length over complexity. Length, the longer the password, the more difficult it is to crack, but also using less complicated passwords makes it easier to remember, like for humans, not necessarily machines, right? And the thing is, if you get it right, if you have, long, passwords that are well monitored, you probably don't need to expire them that often, right? And that gives people, that takes away the repetitive nature of people creating passwords that repeat. Have MFA everywhere. Like I said, people tend to put it where they believe it's necessary, but you really need to put it everywhere. Also on internal, I mean, having it as a step-up type of authentication method, when performing sensitive operations on the inside is really a must in today's world. Also practical, no default or weak passwords. Like I said, having company-specific passwords is a big no-no because they do leak. It's easy to guess, and we find them literally everywhere. And lastly, don't forget that machines are feelings too, right? Service accounts, machine accounts, devices that you plug into the network, those typically do get forgotten along the way because they're not people, right? You can't educate them, and they rely on people to set and maintain those passwords. You need to make sure that whenever you tie anything that's a machine-related account or device to your network, make sure that those password policies are your passwords are treated the same way as a normal human does. Regular identity audits. Make sure that you've got, that you don't have weak passwords in your network. Make sure that you weed out dormant accounts, monitor for failed logins, suspicious logins, and even logins from geographical regions where users are not supposed to be. Some of the quickest things that you can do this week is just to quickly check your organization to make sure that there's no passwords contained in current breaches. In the next 3 months, just take a look at redefine your current password policy. Make sure that it is not just defaults. Relook your MFA implementations, right? Make sure that you've got strong authentication everywhere where it matters. And then continuous user education and implement regular identity audits as sort of like BAU of your business. Every 6 months, do it. Yeah, that's it for us. This is me and Ahmed. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. Yeah. Thank you.